All right, let's dive right into this explainer, where we're going to explore a deeply uncomfortable but absolutely fascinating critique of modern persuasion techniques. If you've ever read a business book on influence or sales, you know the drill. You're likely super familiar with the gentle art of building rapport and finding those perfect win-win scenarios. But today, we're looking at a source text that argues those modern techniques are kind of missing the point. They are completely ignoring the older, much harsher reality of how human compliance actually works.
We actually start with this stark historical observation from Mao Zedong. Why? Because it grounds our analysis in the raw, unfiltered reality of coercion. We are deliberately stepping way outside the comfortable bubble of corporate negotiations and HR policies. To truly understand power and influence, we've got to acknowledge the absolute extremes of human history and political force.
So, what if everything you know about persuasion is really only half the story? Popular frameworks like Kurt Mortensen's hugely successful book, Maximum Influence, give us these great 12 laws of persuasion. But the skeptic's core argument here is that these books only map the safe, beautifully manicured parks of human interaction. They completely forget to tell us what lies in the unforgiving wilderness just outside the fences.
Section 1. The Soft Influence Bubble.
According to Mortensen's framework, soft skills account for a massive 85% of your professional success. And you know what? The skeptic absolutely agrees this is directionally true. But, and this is a massive but, it is only true within stable, rule-of-law societies. Societies where customers can easily leave and people have the genuine freedom to simply say no.
Here's the crucial point. Soft persuasion only really works because of a massive, invisible load-bearing structure sitting right underneath it. As defined by the sociologist Max Weber, the state maintains a monopoly on violence. Think about it. We can only negotiate in pleasantries in a cozy conference room because the state has entirely removed physical coercion from the table. If that monopoly breaks down, well, those 12 laws of influence become completely irrelevant.
Section 2. Plata or plomo.
Plata o plomo. Silver or lead. Pablo Escobar didn't exactly use soft psychology or mirroring techniques on Colombian judges, right? Instead, he presented a stark, binary choice: immense material reward or a literal existential threat. It definitely wasn't ethical, but historically speaking, it worked with just extraordinary consistency. The choice architecture was beautifully simple, and the persuasion was absolute.
Section 3. Soft laws versus hard reality.
Take Mortensen's law of connectivity. It basically says you've got to be liked to influence someone. But the skeptic totally channels Machiavelli here. In high-stakes environments, fear produces far more reliable compliance than affection ever could. Affection fluctuates, right? It changes with mood and circumstance. But fear, when it's backed by a credible threat, is mathematically consistent. Escobar didn't need a judge to like him, he just needed them to rule in his favor.
When you look at the mechanics of these two systems, they're fundamentally different. Soft influence creates this tiny psychological debt. You buy someone a coffee, they subconsciously feel obliged to listen to your pitch. But hard coercion, that applies pure rational choice theory, just like economist Gary Becker talked about. When Escobar offered life-changing money, psychological reciprocity wasn't even needed. Compliance simply became the most mathematically logical choice a person could possibly make.
Mortensen also relies heavily on the law of dissonance, carefully creating internal tension in a client's mind over a few weeks to gently pivot their viewport. But consider this. What resolves cognitive dissonance faster? A clever conversational pivot? Or a direct threat to your family that forces an immediate choice between your principles and your actual survival? Yeah, fear resolves cognitive conflict instantly.
We also see a massive difference when it comes to urgency. Artificial scarcity, like when a website says, hey, only 3 items left in stock, is just a mild simulation of urgency. But Plata o plomo triggers our psychological fear of loss aversion at the absolute highest level. We've evolved to spot fake marketing deadlines, sure, but literally nobody develops immunity to a deadline where the consequence is the maximum irreversible loss of life.
And think about the words used. Mortensen spends a ton of time on verbal packaging, pacing, finding the absolute perfect synonyms. But Escobar, he used exactly 4 words: plata o plomo. This perfectly illustrates philosopher J.L. Austin's concept of performative speech, words that don't just describe reality but actively create it. The phrase was backed by such a horrific track record of violence that the institutional reality was the only packaging needed. The message isn't the words themselves, the message is the reality backing them up.
Social proof operates entirely differently here too.
Soft influence uses positive validation, like showing off a bunch of happy, satisfied customers. Coercive power, on the other hand, relies entirely on negative validation. Historically, massive behavioral shifts, like the expansion of authoritarian regimes, were driven by the very public, very negative demonstration of what happens to those who say no. You comply simply because you've seen the brutal cost of dissent.
When told he should maybe consider the Pope's views, Joseph Stalin famously fired back, "How many divisions does the Pope have?" This chilling dismissal perfectly captures the skeptic's view here. Moral authority and social validation are completely ignored by hard power if they aren't backed by the coercive military capacity to actually enforce that compliance.
Moving on, soft influence heavily relies on the Pygmalion effect. That's the idea that if you just believe in someone, they'll naturally rise up to exceed their self-image. But coercive systems, like early industrial scientific management from guys like Frederick Winslow Taylor, they don't do that. They simply communicate non-negotiable demands. They use rigid structures where failure to perform means an immediate loss of your livelihood. It doesn't inspire you, it scientifically enforces you.
Ultimately, when your literal survival is threatened, the amygdala just completely hijacks both emotion and logic. And this really proves philosopher Thomas Hobbes's point in his famous work, Leviathan. He argued that human society only cooperates under the implicit threat of a higher coercive power. Without it, we'd revert to a war of all against all. Mortenson's laws simply assume Hobbes' Leviathan is already happily doing all the heavy lifting in the background.
Section 4. The limits of coercion. But wait, let's step back for a second. The skeptic completely concedes that while coercion is the absolute ultimate short-term compliance generator, it is a catastrophic long-term strategy. First off, it destroys relationships. Compliance vanishes the exact second the threat does. Second, it's incredibly expensive to scale because it requires constant paranoid monitoring. And third, it inevitably breeds organized rebellion. Escobar's empire, built entirely on this brutal system, ultimately collapsed under these very pressures.
Section 5. The Complete Persuasion Map.
So, the most powerful figures in history? They didn't arbitrarily choose between being liked and being feared. True power requires understanding both playbooks. It's about knowing how to effectively deploy, or at the very least imply, both of them, depending entirely on how much actual freedom and leverage your counterpart possesses in that specific moment.
Keep your friends close and your enemies closer. This classic line from The Godfather perfectly reminds us that the greatest strategists never pretend that the harsh realities of power aren't sitting right there on the table right next to the soft negotiations. You absolutely need those 12 laws of influence for the conference room, but you also must understand the mechanics of hard power to know what game is actually being played.
So I'll leave you with this final thought to really ponder. As you navigate your own professional and personal landscapes, are you only looking at the manicured park? Or are you actively aware of the fences? Knowing the actual landscape you're standing in is the very first step to mastering it. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I highly encourage you to look deeper into the fascinating dynamics of power shaping the world around you.